Great. Well, thank you, Professor Baker. This is like a revisiting of my past. I'm almost speechless. I'd forgotten all this stuff. I want to say at the start, I was an important lawyer at CFE, but Mike Rebell and Joe Whalen and Dick Beattie did an enormous amount of work. I also want to say it was omitted from the biographical materials, but my greatest professional experience since leaving the law was working as a student teacher for Leo Casey. So it was a great experience to understand the complexity of teaching, and that's really what I want to talk about today, the hidden complexity of schools and teaching and how that may or may not play out with school finance. I certainly believe, having spent 8 years of my life, that school funding and school equity are absolutely crucial in the transformation of the New York City public school system and systems across the country. And you know, all of your presentation reminds me of the old lawyer story that school finance litigations are a little bit like Russian novels. They're big, they're brawling, there are thousands of characters, there's hundreds of battles, and at the end of the day, everybody's dead. So you kind of enter that world with a certain...
Not dead yet.
You're not dead yet, nor am I, happily. And I'll live to fight another day. But the reason I say that is there are things we can do now as we work in these larger structural questions to continue to close the achievement gap for young people of color. That, in fact, we all have a role to play even as we go for these fundamental conditions that are absolutely essential to the transformation of American education. There are things we can do. And so after working on the Campaign for Fiscal Equity and as a lawyer in the education space for 10 years, I shifted and went to the New Visions for Public Schools. New Visions is an organization that is 25 years old this year. We have representatives of the Department of Education, of the AFT, of the UFT, a variety of different stakeholders and community groups on our board. And we're constantly thinking about how can we prove education in the constraints in the box that are built by policy decisions and finance as it exists today. And the good news is I think there are changes that can have a substantial impact on thousands of kids' lives. But there are tough changes and they're challenging changes. And I think the lesson that I want to put forward and argue for is as we push for school finance change and as we push these broader policy levers, we need to constantly be thinking not about polishing the little red schoolhouse of the past, but really thinking about how we use these new levers to transform public education and make them much more effective than they are today. Because to be sure, the failure, for example, of school finance systems to understand student need and account for student need in the way they distribute resources is absolutely problematic and prevents the types of social services and other supports that young people need to be successful in school. We know that social emotional learning is crucial to later adult success, and it's absolutely critical that we put resources in and supports in to enable young people to develop those skills and in many ways to add to the skill sets that they already have, because young people come into school with an extraordinary number of assets. But I think the other change that I think is really crucial to think about is where are we successful and where are we not successful, and what can we do now, and how can we use any new dollars and resources to kind of expand on what we know is working. And so one thing I thought I would do is, this is a report that's in your packet, and if you just pull it out, let's just go through parts of it, because I think it underscores some of the themes I want to hit today. When I was a young lawyer at Advocates for Children, that's where I started my career for the first 3 years, I did a bunch of things. I represented individual students and saw the variation in every young person requiring personalization to be successful. I worked on special ed class action litigation, and there what was fascinating is good intentioned systems ultimately being co-opted in some instances, so you could see the racial pathology of New York City play out in who was placed in the most segregated special ed placements furthest from the general ed classroom. Because there weren't supports, there weren't services, and our blinders necessarily didn't see what kids needed. I worked with homeless kids. We did a lot of work in the Stuart McKinney bills in those days, and what was so clear is there are social forces that can overwhelm what happens in the classroom. So how do we think about that? How do we address it straight on, honestly, and openly? And ultimately, you know, I did a lot of work representing parents in thinking about zoning and a variety of other choices that they had within their neighborhoods and outside of their neighborhoods. And it was crucial. Parent voice, community voice has to play a role as we're thinking about this transformation that we want to enact with school finance. So those things are to say, schools are systems. They're complicated systems that we frequently underestimate in the kind of systematic, in sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, deprofessionalization of what schools are and what teachers do on a day-to-day basis. So if you turn, and I'll leave this, you'll have this paper, but one of the things that I think is so interesting, if you turn to page 11, And you look at figure 4. I'm sorry to the audience who isn't here. You can download this report at New Visions, www.newvisions.org, and then go to reports. And you'll see it. It's called Design and Data in Balance. If you look at page 11, one of the things that's so remarkable is to think about the complexity of young people as they move through courses. And think about the needs they have, the attributes and abilities they have, and the challenges they have in getting to mastery around a particular subject. And then imagine you're a principal and a teacher trying to make that work for 400 or 800, or in the case of Fort Hamilton High School in New York City, 4,400 young people, knowing that each individual student's needs has to be met in a very complex way. So you just look at 10th grade to 11th grade. Here are the 3 courses that were offered at the High School for Telecommunications in Brooklyn. Look at the variation of what can happen in that class, and then think about you want to improve teacher quality, but the reality is some kids will master the material, some kids won't. What's your next step in just scheduling a young person for the next course? And how do you ensure that there are courses that are available if you're working kind of in a batch system? Think if you're a teacher and you have a class, let's just take 9th grade literacy, that's reading from 5th grade to 11th grade, and you have 140 students that you're responsible for over the course of the day in literacy. Somehow we have to acknowledge the diversity, and it has to be more than just differentiation or scaffolded knowledge, because no teacher, I think, or very few select heroic teachers can manage what it takes to get a young person to standard who's reading at a 5th grade level and simultaneously challenge a young person who's addressing an 11th grade level. So one of the things we've started to look at is how do you create systems that take the heroism out of the day-to-day life of teaching and kind of really, we need heroes, and all teachers are, I think, jumping into schools and doing what they do with so few resources and little support. But how do we systematically create conditions where adults can be more successful with young people they have and continue to kind of grow, learn, and have the lives of adults? And so we're actively pursuing an agenda where we're looking at classroom tools and trying to kind of build tools that enable teachers to manage their classrooms more effectively. But more importantly, we're trying to figure out what school systems, what we can do as schools to reduce the variation that a typical teacher has to address in their classroom. So by that I mean, are there ways that we can actually create alternatives for young people that address their needs and supplement and support what a teacher is doing, so that the variation a teacher confronts is not 700 different problems, but 400 different problems or 300 different problems. And the reason I make a big deal about that is if you go to page 15, you'll see what we refer to as a stock and flow pattern. This has really been, for the last 7 years, New Visions has been working with 80 high schools in the city, working with about 50,000 students, supporting the schools and teachers and students and their families in those buildings. And one of the things we've been able to do is really look at data in new ways. And many times we look at data in a point in time, but what does data look like when you look at it across 4 years? So the graph that you have on page 15 is looking again at the High School for Telecommunications, and it's showing how students progress over time from 9th grade to 12th grade. We've done this for all 80 of our schools, and if you go on our website, you can actually download the program to do this yourselves in your own schools if you have the data. But what I think is so fascinating is that as you look at the progress of students over time, blue is career and college ready under New York State metrics. And it's pretty valid. If a young person meets certain CUNY benchmarks in New York State, if they get an advanced Regents diploma, they persist in college. It's very clear. It's a correlation, it's not causation, but it really does indicate that those are important variables to look at. Green is just really on track for a Regents diploma. Yellow and orange, you're starting to kind of fall off from that. And red is you're entering 9th grade with very low ELA and math scores and probably bad attendance in middle school. What's fascinating to me in the debate is we talk about a whole host of different factors, but when we ran this, every school of 80 schools, every year for 3 years, some schools were better at moving kids to green and blue. Some schools were better or struggled with losing kids from green to red. But no schools were able to move red students over the course of 4 years from 9th grade to 12th grade. Why is that important? Because I think it says that there are a set of systems that affect student performance as much as the individual effort that students, teachers, and principals put in. And it's the structure and the design of that structure that in some instances leads to the result. So when I look at these red kids, or the young people who are showing up as red on this graph, what it makes me realize, and I'm very much open to debate on this, but what it makes me realize is so much of the debate we have in public education that doesn't look at systems and ignores the ramification of systems is wrong and will never lead to the results we need to close the achievement gap for young people. So the young people who are in ninth grade need a radically different type of education from the one we're providing. Because the schools, whether they're A schools or F schools under the old New York City accountability system, whether they had hundreds of effective teachers or a significant number of ineffective teachers, all showed this same pattern. So somehow the metrics we were using for accountability didn't grasp this. So we need a different strategy for these people. And as we think about closing funding gaps, as we think about restructuring systems, we need to carve out a place for innovation. Innovation that enables all voices to participate, innovation that squarely looks at problems around data and the achievement of different groups, innovation that has the aspiration that all young people can learn, innovation that's bold and not afraid of taking on what we've inherited in schools and our nostalgia in schools, but really challenging it and pushing it forward. So I'll leave you with one example where I think innovation did work, and it's not an uncontroversial subject. In 2001, working with the Department of Education, with the United Federation of Teachers, with the Council of Supervisors and Administrators, and working with 220 community-based organizations, we decided to look at low-performing high schools in the Bronx where 35 to 45% of the young people in those buildings were graduating over 4 years. Educational devastation, right? And for those communities, it was dismal. And what we did was, through a collaborative process, we worked with teachers, shut those buildings down, and created space for teachers, parents, and community groups to come together and reimagine what education could be. This is not the model of small schools that continued throughout New York City, and that's not the argument I'm making. I'm saying that there was a very specific collaborative process that produced 100 high schools, and they were of wide variation. They integrated social services. They had different views and stances on what kids needed to know and be able to do. And 5 and 6 years out, those schools started to achieve graduation rates of 65, 75, 80%. And what's particularly amazing is when you compare the kids who went to those schools and the kids who were attending others similarly with similar demographics, we saw increases in graduation rates among young men of color of 12%. We saw increases in graduation rates across every demographic we looked at. And in the most recent report from MDRC, we're seeing increased college persistence rates across all those different demographics. What does that say to me? It says change and reform are possible. We aren't going to get to the promised land with the resources we have. And when you look at facilities, when you look at salaries of teachers and the wage differentials, all those things, they're going to continue to be a problem and we have to fix them. But there are changes, and there are things we can do if we're bold, if we're collaborative, if we include the right voices, if we have a sense of urgency, and if we drive forward. Thank you for your attention.